part one in a two-part series on power analyses for repeated measures ANOVAs, specifically on how to do them using a program called G-Power. So G-Power is a free point-and-click tool that is used for doing power calculations. It's pretty popular, probably because it's pretty user-friendly, and it does a large variety of power analyses for different types of statistical tests. One of those types of tests is a repeated measures ANOVA, and it can do them for either ANOVAs that only have repeated measures factors or ones that have a combination of between and within subjects factors. The issue is that doing these types of analyses in G-Power correctly can actually be a little bit confusing because the program is often looking for slightly different inputs than you would think it's looking for. And so across these two videos, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do power analyses in G-Power for repeated measures designs, and some of those little idiosyncrasies of the program that are kind of hidden. So in part one, I'm going to be talking about the issue of effect size, specifically talking about the effect size G-Power thinks you have and the effect size you actually have. So this is what G-Power looks like. It has a couple of different options for test family, and then within each test family, it has many different options for the actual statistical test you want to run power analyses on. So right now I'm looking at the F-test family, ANOVA repeated measures within factor. So you can see it has a number of inputs that it's going to take. It's going to ask you for an effect size, which is a Cohen's F. Most of the time for ANOVAs, we don't have a Cohen's F. We actually have a partial eta squared. So if we click on this determine, we can actually input a partial eta squared, whatever we want. We have to tell it the alpha level, the power we want to achieve, the number of groups our design has, the number of measures our design has, and then it asks for the correlation among repeated factors and the correction for non-sphericity. So that's a lot of different inputs, but the main one I'm going to be talking about is this partial eta squared input. So the issue with the effect size is that G-Power thinks the partial eta squared you're giving it does not take into account the fact that there's a correlation between the levels of the your within subjects factor. G-Power is expecting a partial eta squared that actually wouldn't be any different whether a particular study was within subjects or between subjects. And you can kind of tell this by the fact that it's asking you for what that correlation between the factors is. It doesn't think the effect size is taking that into account, so it needs to know what it is so it can take that into account when it's doing the power calculation. The issue is that a lot of times the partial eta squared we have actually does already include the information about that correlation in the effect size itself. So some of you may be familiar with a particular formula for calculating partial eta squared, and this is the sum of squares of the effect divided by the sum of squares from the effect plus the sum of squares for the error. So because this formula uses the sums of squares from the F-test, any partial eta squared that's calculated using this formula is already going to take into account the correlation among the levels of a within subjects factor. And so because of that, if you use a partial eta squared that's calculated using this formula, you're not going to be giving G-Power the input that it thinks it's getting. So obviously, if you calculate your partial eta squared by hand, you'll know whether you're using this formula or not. Different statistical programs calculate partial eta squared differently. Some use this formula, some don't. For example, SPSS does calculate the partial eta squared based on the sums of squares from the F-test. One way you can check whether your particular program does that or not is to actually get the program to output the partial eta squared and then calculate your own partial eta squared by hand using this formula. And if the numbers match up, then you know that the partial eta squared in your particular program does take into account the correlation because it uses this formula. So how can we actually tell that the input G-Power thinks it's getting is different from the input we're actually giving it? So one way we can actually check this is to look at a two-cell within subjects design. We can either run that using a t-test or using an f-test. Now, because the design is exactly the same and the mean, standard deviation, and correlation should be the same, we should get out the same sample size requirements whether we run it as an f-test or as a t-test. And so we can actually check whether we get that in G-Power if we just use the default settings. So what I'm going to do is run the power calculation in G-Power with the f-test and the t-test using effect sizes that are analogous to one another. So for the partial eta squared, I'm going to have 0.199. going to calculate that and transfer it over. And then the correlation between the two levels of my factor is 0.369, and I have two measurements. So if I calculate this, G-Power is telling me I would need 19 samples. So if I now go to the t-test, so t-test match pairs because it's a within subjects t-test, and I put in the analogous Cohen's d, which is 0.486, I should get that 19 again. What I actually get is 57. And so that's telling me that something's up, something's weird. So what's weird is that the partial eta squared I inputted was a partial eta squared that was calculated using that formula from before. So it's a partial eta squared that G-Power is not expecting. So if I go back to the f-test, there's this option button way down here. And if I click on this, I get 4 options for how my effect size was calculated. So if the partial eta squared I'm giving G-Power takes into account the correlation already, if it's calculated based on that sum of squared effect divided by sum of square effect plus sum of squared error formula, I want to choose this as an SPSS option. Whether I'm using SPSS or not, this is just a way to tell the program that the partial eta squared I'm giving you takes into account that correlation already. So if I say OK here, you'll notice a couple things. One is that my effect size is now an f of u, and the input for that correlation has gone away because the correlation is already wrapped into my partial eta squared. So if I calculate the effect size again, transfer it over, rerun the power calculation, I'm now getting 56 samples, which is just one away from that 57 that the t-test was telling me. And so what this illustrates is that the solution is to use the as an SPSS option in G-Power if the partial eta squared you're using is calculated based off those sums of squares from the ANOVA table. So in part 2, I'm going to talk about higher order designs. So specifically designs where you have multiple crossed within subjects factors. G-Power actually assumes you have one within subjects factor, which is not entirely clear from the inputs. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can tell that, and then what you can do if you do have a cross within subjects design to still use G-Power to do some power calculations. As with all our videos, all the material related to this video, as well as the repeated measures part 2, are available on the OSF. So if you go to our main project and just click on part 1, it'll take you to the project for both the repeated measures videos. So that's where you can find any of the R code that I'm going to use in part 2, as well as the slides for parts 1 and 2. So hopefully this has been helpful. As always, please feel free to comment on the videos, comment on the OSF page, or email us with any questions, comments, ideas for other videos you would find particularly helpful. We love hearing back from users. You can either email us at stats-consulting@cos.io or contact@cos.io. Thanks.